Today's talk is sponsored by the Penn Weitzman Alumni Association. The PWAA is here to be a professional, creative, and social resource to the Weitzman alumni community of over 11,000 members. The PWAA aims to support and strengthen the school by increasing communication amongst graduates from all departments and their friends by offering counsel to its leadership, by assisting with fundraising on its behalf, and by connecting alumni from its various departments with the professional disciplines which its graduates profess. Give me one moment. I need to click on some things here. Okay, here we go. So we do record these talks, and that's what I was enabling just now. We have a webpage devoted to this virtual talk series, and a link will be added to the chat where you can view recordings. We will share the link in follow-up communications. For this event, please use the Q&A function for questions for the speakers. And in the chat, please introduce yourself with your name, degree, and year of graduation. This is a nice way for everyone attending to see who is here. One small note, please be sure you are sending your comment to all presenters and attendees so everyone can see it. Use the blue drop down to change who you're sending it to. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Ehrenbard, and our moderator, Doah Lee. Ehrenbard is a sculptor based in Philadelphia whose multidisciplinary practice intertwines fine art with design, research, architecture, and custom fabrication. Ehrenbard uses sculpture as a means of releasing human energy into a physical form. She works extensively with metals and fiber to push the materials into realms that surpass reasoning and give an inner logic to her work. Ehrenbard is interested in connecting to viewers on a core level by illuminating sensations of being alive and capturing innately shared experience. The human body as an emotive gesture has been a central and evolving theme in her work over the years. From 2015 to 2020, Ehrenbard was a member of Kieran Timberlake's research group, where she delved into various material studies and engaged architects in prototyping at a one-to-one scale. Additionally, she produced creative installations for the US Embassy London, University of Washington, and Wellesley College, working collaboratively with respective architectural design teams. In 2019, after revitalizing a carriage house into a metalworking studio, Ehrenbard co-founded Carriage Creative Company to expand her professional practice into custom design and fabrication. She has a BFA in sculpture from Rhode Island School of Design from 2012 and has been awarded scholarships with Vermont Studio Center, Chashama, and Center for Metal Arts. Our other presenter is Doah Lee, who received her MFA from our school, Penn Weitzman, in 2016. She is an interdisciplinary visual artist based in Philadelphia. Doah was born and raised in Seoul, South Korea. She earned her MFA from the University of Pennsylvania and her BFA with a concentration in painting and printmaking at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In her work, Lee explores and exploits cultural symbols through repetition and a practice that mediates on cultural transition, immigration, otherness, and femininity, in focusing more specifically on the issues of self-identification. She searches through the ways how children speak, listen, see, and draw, and their relationships with the influencing points over a person's identity under socio-political and cultural pressures. Her work has been featured in various exhibitions in Virginia, Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and Seoul, South Korea. Lee has been a resident artist at Vermont Studio Center and Cheltenham Center of the Art. She is a curator and co-director of an artist-run exhibition space, Fjord Gallery. Currently, Lee works as a visiting art critic and artist in residency at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and teaches at Haverford. So welcome. And to Erica, please begin our wonderful presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill, and everyone on the team making this possible. Screen shared. So thanks again for everyone being here, everyone who made this talk possible and inviting me to speak today. I'm going to begin by going a little bit into some background of my artistic practice and how I work as a sculptor artist. And then I'll move into how I apply some of those principles into design work, as well as transitioning into somewhat of a virtual studio visit, as we say, by way of looking at some recent projects in custom fabrication, which should give you all a glimpse of my studio and work that goes on within it. So as was introduced a bit in Jill's introduction, I work very intuitively, specifically with materials, and my interaction with material, specifically metals and fiber, are a real important driving factor to the work that I make. I learn my media in a really intimate way and work very hands-on, which continuously informs what I will do next, and also continuously involves the type of objects that I compose. So as an example of this type of evolution through interaction, I'm going to go back in time quite a bit here to look at a trajectory of work that I did in fiber. So back when I first taught myself how to knit, I started knitting large swaths of yarn and essentially creating almost a net-like form around steel objects by sort of sewing it together and enveloping metal objects with long knit pieces. But I quickly became interested in making my own tools and changing the sizes and dynamic of how I was knitting and what happens within one piece. So I started to fabricate knitting needles in metal to get super thin ones, use wood dowels to make, knitting needles over 1 inch in diameter, and started to see what would happen if I combined multiple tools within one piece of work. And that was compelling to me because I could create a sense in these instances of constriction, of a tapered form, almost a tightening as in an hourglass shape, or I could get bigger as I work and sort of dissipate a floor plane of yarn to create a space for a sculpture to live within. So the tools and the process of knitting started to inform what kind of shapes and impact it could have in a very physical and real way. I also brought the knitting process into the metal shop and started to use what I learned so intimately about the structure of how knitting links onto itself and applied that to my work in the metal shop. So metal, unlike yarn, can't continuously be woven in and out of itself, but I could break it down into singular loops and forge each loop separately and then interlock them. And what I learned quickly working in metal with knitting is that it is very conducive to creating a vertical singular line, much better than a sort of horizontal continuous line. And so interlocking the loops vertically allowed me also to sort of splay them out because they had some rotation in them. And that started to inform the type of object that, even going back to the yarn creating a constriction, it actually went hand in hand with how a metal loop could create an opening at the top of a form before it then constricts back down. So as I was knitting, I was working in two extremes. One, bringing the knitting process all the way down to the scale of thread. I began knitting sewing thread with sewing needles as the knitting needles, all the way up to heavy steel being forged link by link in the shop. And what I noticed or was compelled by in the small scale of the thread is how insanely delicate and tiny the knitting process was. And it almost felt too delicate, but it reminded me of, for those of you who knit, I'm sure we have plenty of knitters in the audience. One of the first things you do when you begin a knit project is take your skeins of yarn and create yarn spheres so that it more readily unravels for you. And so I thought, what would that process be in thread to give myself a little sort of feed ball of thread to then knit these delicate pieces. And I found myself more compelled by the sphere than I was the knitting. And I think this also marked a point in my work that I really was interested in moving from line to volume. So these tiny, delicate balls of thread, actually, they're delicate on one hand, but they're also really stable and hard, because as the thread wraps around itself over and over again, it becomes a really stable three-dimensional volume with a really interesting, delicate kind of texture and presence. And so I was very compelled by that and did much more of that. I created little mechanisms using parts of sewing machines to assist in creating all of these tiny wound balls of thread. And also, again, I typically shift scales to inform how I'm working. And so I started doing the balls of thread and also scaling it up for spheres of yarn. And the yarn I could get much bigger quicker. And then the ball on the left, which is all thread, just takes dedication to one ball, just continuously winding and winding and winding to make it bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets more and more stable and more hard. And this type of process is very repetitive, but it builds mass, and it offers a sort of moment or long periods of time, actually, of contemplation and sort of connection with this process, and allows me to think about what I'm doing and be present in a physical way with the work that I'm creating. So as I created these spheres, another aspect of fiber is it's very absorptive. And as we all know from, elementary school celery capillary action studies, strands of fiber, as in plants, will absorb liquid and move them from one section to another. But here I have, rather than one line of thread, a whole wound line of thread. So it's very, very absorptive. And I started to use that to my advantage, dipping them in ink and absorbing the ink and allowing me to use this sphere now in a new way, not just as a sculptural volume, but as a tool, in a sense, something that can make its own mark and move in a new way. So I began making, we'll call them drawings, with thread, imprinting their texture onto the paper. And it becomes very much about how my hand is able to interact with a tiny ball of thread when when I'm about to lose it, when I have to turn my hand to keep it on the page. And that dynamic sort of relates to both a very physical presence of when I'm going to lose a ball on a page, and also a more conceptual repetition. I have a lot of squares and spirals in my work over the years, which relate to, a lot of cyclical, repetitious experiences we have as individuals and also in society, and how things can sort of run back over themselves and change direction and continue in a sort of cyclical but repetitive way. And I wouldn't always fully absorb or fully saturate, rather, the balls of thread. If I only put a few drops of it on it, it would completely change the dynamic in which I worked with the ball and how I could draw with it and the type of mark that it would make. And I will say, I'm constantly then thinking about, I'm not working with steel in this work, but then how does this drawing become an object? And how does the frame relate to the drawing? And so fabricating the steel frames to pair with, these are 5 by 5 inch drawings, by the way. And I was also scaling this up. So I had the larger spheres that I made with thread, larger spheres that I made with yarn. And they had a sort of more intense amount of ink that it could press onto paper, but it still has that really intricate line work that comes from the winding over and over and over on itself. And the drawing process with this size is very different than the drawing process with, a 1/2 inch ball of thread versus a 12-inch ball of yarn. Now I'm moving around a panel. It's more about the reach of my entire arm rather than just the sort of press of my palm. And so I'm moving around a painting much more and impressing it and interacting with the yarn in a very different and involved way. The other thing that starts to happen is if I create multiple pieces with the same ball, the amount of pressure that it takes to imprint the ink changes, and the amount of ink it can absorb changes. Some of it starts to dry out. Some of it is potentially stuck in between the fibers, and it starts to get a little muddier, and I have to use more pressure. And so that interaction starts to come through in subsequent pieces. And these yarn pieces are about 40 inches by 40 inches. You see the difference in size on the left, the tiny thread drawings and the larger yarn drawings. So I'm sort of walking through, knitting, wrapping yarn, drawing with yarn, just a very sort of process-oriented way of talking about my work today. And I wanted to touch on why I'm doing that. My aim is not to make work about process or make that a central concept that a viewer should think about necessarily when they see my work, but it is my way of reaching an inner logic. And it's my way of getting closer to what I feel is a very important part of my whole artistic practice, which is bringing a presence to the work that feels it is its own. Some pieces may have a sense that they made themselves almost, or that they make sense to themselves and the materials make sense and they're doing something that feels natural. And so my way of making work that feels like it is its own being and its own inner logic is by getting as close as possible and working with it so much that I'm not being as logical maybe in designing what I'm going to make, but rather really integrating in how and what material can be and what it can do. And that is why it's so important to me to work so much with my media. I'll take some conceptual assistance from a philosopher from the early 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer. He describes idea with a capital I as universal and inherent, quote from his book, The World as Will and Idea. Idea proper is not this spatial form which hovers before me. My box is, but its expression, its pure significance, its inner being. Let me read that one more time. Idea proper is not this spatial form which hovers before me, but its expression, its pure significance, its inner being. This is what I'm trying to achieve in my work, an idea with a capital I, an expression and a pure significance and an inner being that viewers can feel just by being with it. There's no explanation needed. There's no concept I'm trying to drive into anyone's head or huge statement that I'm making, but rather connecting with humanity and connecting with our own existence in a visceral and sort of inexplicable way that you can feel the idea of the work without being told what it is. So I sort of walked through one trajectory in yarn and made it seem fairly linear, but in reality, it's not that linear, and I'm constantly being informed by one thing I'm doing and letting it cross over into the next. And so similarly, how the yarn went from, a knit line into a wrapped volume. I used to use Tig Welding as, again, an expressed line or pattern, as you see on the left, and then learning how to really push the boundaries of Tig Welding, how to bring the molten metal back on itself rather than just to join two pieces, and ultimately moving into fully enclosed volumes that just the molten metal of welding creates by pushing it and spending enough time with it to learn how I can create new volumes that relate to how it functions and how it can move metal and how it can create new overlapping textures. Similarly, just the concept of wrapping, that had a longer history as well. First using thread to wrap steel and sew it together, then maybe letting go of the thread and using the steel to wrap around itself, creating a sense of a form by leaving it empty inside, and then into wrapping a material on itself to create a fully solid volume. And then allowing these two things to again cross over and become part of the same piece. So as I started to learn how to push welding to create these full volumes and tapered forms by moving the molten metal in a certain way, it was also being informed by the spheres of wrapped yarn that could live inside of it. And the yarn then informed how I had to fabricate the steel so that I didn't burn an entire ball of yarn inside of a welded head, but had to construct it in a way that the two could actually live in unity together. Then I want to talk a little bit about applying some of this logic to design work and in particular site-specific work. This is a public art project that I'm collaborating with Jill Sablosky, our host today, at Engine 37 Firehouse. And it's a historic firehouse. We took cues from the architecture and some of the line work and stone in the building. And then for the metal work, I was really drawn towards and interested in relating to a folded fire hose. So I went back to my studio and started folding steel to understand how that reacts, how it looks, how it feels. Does it give us that sense of a sort of a folded fire hose and relating to an action that a fireman might do in the metal shop? And so, creating a public art proposal, we were spending a lot of time creating a digital model of our bench or sculptural seating. And so working digitally, creating renderings, working on a computer, I sort of have to pair with that actual material knowledge and understanding of how the material wants to or can create some form. So I was creating these loops back on themselves and fine-tuning what we were going to model. So informing what goes into a digital model with very physical, real sort of forged steel processes. Similarly, this is a project that I worked on while at my position in the research group at Kieran Timberlake with the architectural team for University of Washington. And they wanted to create these pieces in reclaimed wood and metal for their client. And we worked together very closely to develop, how it exists on the site and what kind of cues we're going to take from the campus, from material, and from digital work. So while working digitally, and how are we going to pull, I should say, so University of Washington, one of the central themes we were talking about is the landscape, and the team really wanted to give a piece of the landscape into the project, into the residents of the dorm. So we were looking for ways to bring sort of mountainous topography into an interior space. We were working digitally and drawing and pulling topography from mountains that related to campus, and working digitally, also looking at how they were going to sit in the architecture and relate to a lounge. But also I was making physical prototypes and samples to get the team's reaction and really start to suss out what kind of dynamic do we want the metal and wood to have, and what kind of coloration or patina or carving or what kind of topographical effect do we want to have. We were making physical samples to inform how the digital models evolved. And then having the architectural team involved in actually making them. And that was, it's exciting when I get to bring other people into this process of being super hands-on with the materials, and the team got to really intimately know what it was like to work with reclaimed wood and steel and CNC topography, carving, and so we, involving architects in the shop and in this process to sort of expand the impact of that, physical connection. And so I'll move into now a sort of virtual studio visit of Carriage Creative, the company I founded with my husband and partner in 2019. And we are in a carriage house that we have converted into our shop and studio. This is back when we bought it. This isn't even right when we bought it, but it gives a bit of a sense. You see that my husband's wearing a respirator in this image. It was a pretty toxic site when we got it, but we're well ahead of that era. And this is now our shop and metalworking studio. And I'll walk through some of our recent projects, which then will give you a glimpse into our process. This was a set of railings that I designed with a sort of central goal of integrating a handrail into a guardrail to limit the impact on the classically tight row homes staircase. We didn't want to have a handrail that was protruding out and tightening that throughway going up a set of stairs. So integrating a handrail into the upper portion and then integrating that into the curved sort of aesthetic that the clients were interested in. So here it is getting made in our shop. Forging each curve. I believe each one was different. So we, created formwork to bend the curves over, and then on the right you see the guardrail beginning to be fabricated together. Then we also do work for other artists. I love working with other artists as an artist myself. It's sort of a time where I let go of what my aesthetic goals might be and really try to integrate myself into what their aesthetic goals might be. And so in this case, Double Vision Chair by Erica Sellers, you know, we knew she wanted really sharp lines. You know, I might be showing and welding welds on top of themselves and expressing it as texture. But when, you know, making work for someone like this, I know that every weld must be ground back and disappear, and it should not be on anyone's mind when you're looking at her work. And so this is actually wood and metal. And so I work closely with Erica to develop exactly how the wood is going to attach into the metal, and I'm sort of perfecting all those details so that when someone looks at a piece of sculpture, they're not distracted by any sort of technical details. And so this is a glimpse into making work like that. These were some rectangular prisms for light fixtures, but same kind of thing. They needed to be welded together. It's lots of welding, and then they all get ground back and turned into very sharp, precise rectangular prisms. This is another project. It was a series of works, a sort of collection of 12 growing to 18-ish with Tavares Strachan called Distant Relatives. So in this piece, Tavares was bringing together three-dimensional 3D printed plaster heads of historical figures and pairing them with African masks. So this project, very, you know, multimedia, and his goal was to get these pairs of objects held, you know, about 2 feet above a pedestal with brass in a very finely crafted and non-distracting way. So I worked with him and his team very closely to develop how this would be possible. Every mask was different, every head was different. So it was, you know, getting into even the woodworking, how a mask is going to be held by the brass. You can't just, you know, stick it up there and hope it works. So this was, you know, very multimedia on my end as well, color matching to put blocking in the masks that look natural to the mask, and making a piece feel of its own language rather than having things that distract. So, you know, using wood where it should be wood, metal where it should be metal, plaster where it should be plaster. And again, a shot from the shop. And similar to the some more design-oriented projects, when doing this work, being that every mask was different, every head was different, but they need to relate to each other, and I'm creating a whole collection, or you know, he's creating a collection, and I'm building these components that need to work for the whole thing. I was working a lot in Rhino, working with his team to fine-tune all of the measurements and details, how each mask is held, what kind of blocking, where is it, aligning eye levels. So lots of little details to just make sure that we get right. And then lots of little components, as you see on the right in brass, you know, little escutcheons and sleeves that fit over each other to make everything look seamless. So here are the brass stands without the heads and masks on them that we made in our shop. The escutcheons on the left, and you see the bent brass on the right, various components. And then the last two projects I'm going to share are work that we did upstairs in our studio. So this is an image from, again, back when we bought the carriage house. The big dividing wall, lots of walls that have since been removed. So the first is the beam that we put up. I'll show this time lag to give you a sense. There was a brick wall dividing the house, or the carriage house, roughly in half, that was sitting on an I-beam on the first floor. So it was deflecting quite a bit, and we determined that we needed to remove the brick wall to relieve some of the the weight and tension downstairs, which also gave us the opportunity to sort of open our floor plan, and is really beneficial. So we made a composite beam with one channel on one side, another channel on the other side, bolted together, put up 2 steel columns, removed the brick from underneath, and then capped the bottom with a steel plate that essentially holds the brick, or prevents any sort of dust from falling down, to create this sort of composite steel and brick beam on 2 columns, get rid of all of the brick underneath. That's sort of what we ended up with. Opening up the space. On the left, you see a bit of detail on how the pieces are sort of all welded together to create this new structural element in the carriage house. And then the back window that you see, we've also replaced with a new steel window. We wanted to insulate it, do double pane IGUs. And so the design for this relates to, you know, the patterning of brick. They're offset from each other, still keeping the glass large enough and much larger than it was before, sort of getting more openness, and also keeping the dividing lines sort of equal, and so that the operable section doesn't feel like it's out of place in the overall design, but everything sort of fits into that brick pattern. I'm glazing that on the right after install. So here, that project is in the shop. Sort of looking at the operability on the right, the forged handle and fabricated frame. And on the left, painting this piece before it gets installed. And so our shop is modest in size, and we try to focus sort of our attention on one project at a time, sometimes 2, but we really do, because we work in such a detailed way and sort of thoroughly invested in each project. You know, one project can definitely take over our space sometimes before the next one comes in. So that here we had to, you know, turn the shop into a paint shop for a little bit. And that is my studio and shop and practice. And I'm happy to take questions and sort of to Doah.
Okay. Great, Erica. Thank you so much for your great talk tonight. And it's so interesting to listen to and see your whole body of work and your interdisciplinary approach in your studio practice, and then also for your public art projects. And also for the audience, I want to friendly remind you that this is open Q&A section. So please feel free to ask any question in the chat, and then I will read them to Erica. So actually, Erica, I have one question for you while I was listening to your talk. Like fiber and metal, their materiality in your work is very important component in your art practice. Can you talk about them a little bit more, like their material elements and why they become your main vehicle in your art practice and what they mean to you?
Sure. So yeah, steel in particular, but metals and fiber have been a central part of my work for many, many years now. It's interesting because I've worked in many others as well, glass, wood, concrete, stone, sort of everything under the sun in a way, but metals and fiber are what I always come back to, and it always made me feel the most comfortable. And I think what I'll say is that my artistic practice is a reflection of my life and my lifestyle, and what, you know, I talked a lot about how these sort of intimate working with my media is so important, which means I need to want to work with that material sort of every day or all the time. And there's a balance that began to happen with the sort of setting of working with metals and being in a metal shop. And it's very sort of structural, but in my mind, very malleable. I think I was more drawn to metals for their malleability than their structural nature, and just how formable it can be and how molten can move in a different way. But it's a really harsh atmosphere, one might say, or it's very physically demanding, and I really love that. And so it's always sort of drawn me back to it, and it just is this material that can really express what I'm feeling and kind of have a lot of dynamics of hard and soft and malleable and structural. And then fiber is almost like a break. This might sound silly, but working with yarn and fiber gave me an ability to work comfortably, like in a comfortable, quiet, maybe more space where I'm working by myself. I mean, I early on was constantly in a shop with tons of other people and sharing it. And so sort of having a balance between shop work and sort of soft, comfortable work gives my own life balance. And I think it goes hand in hand with giving my work balance.
Interesting. We got one question. So when you speak like working between digital and physical, is it harder to begin or conceptualize in one over the other?
It is harder for me personally to conceptualize what I'm going to do digitally. I much prefer to use the digital process as an aid to physical rather than the other way around. I've been in the position of the other way around, but I can't say I prefer it. Like there was the piece that I showed with the welded head and the yarn inside of it. Once I started making it, I used a digital model to work out, maybe fabricating that tapered form and making sure the balance was going to be right. And so I think working digitally for me, it can pick up some of the precision elements and planning and making sure you catch sort of every detail about making something function. But in my mind, a sort of conceptual decision of where I'm going to start or where I want to go, I'd rather do physically. But working in architecture, I've definitely done, you start somewhere maybe more digitally, and that helps define some direction, and then I can pair it with something physical and sort of evolve it. I think both are beneficial processes, like either direction. But if I was speaking for myself, I would start physically.
I see. Going back to your sculpture work that you mentioned, I can see that some like linear drawing elements start translating into this heavy metal material in your sculpture format. Can you tell us about you mentioned a little bit, but can you tell us about your process of art making, how your idea drawing these fundamental elements turn into your sculpture?
Yeah, so drawing versus kind of creating a more structural form. I almost see them pretty similarly in that whether I'm drawing or sculpting, as they say, or fabricating, to me, it's sort of like a dance with material. It engages my body in a different way. And it's sort of following that dynamic between letting one lead and following it, and then reverse. That for me is present in both. Drawing has been essential to my practice since forever, or since I began art making. And I think at first it may have informed sculpture, but now I see them almost indistinguishable from each other. Like they're both physical processes, and whether I'm drawing or welding, I'm thinking about like what is the material I'm using and how is it engaging my body and how am I reacting to it. So even like a charcoal drawing, it's like how can this charcoal move on a page and how is it interacting with my hand? Just as I am with, how can this molten metal move or get bigger or widen? So I hope that answers your question. It's sort of like it's very fluid.
I see. And then also like people are very interesting about your materiality. We got a one question that can you talk about the sourcing and processing of reclaimed materials and how it creates constraints of how it may inspire your pieces?
So I don't know if they're maybe thinking in specific about the wood and metal panels versus my own sculpture, but I think when and if I use reclaimed materials, it informs what I'm going to do with it by way of some of the characteristics it might already have. There's one piece that I didn't show today. I just showed the foot of it, but it was a chair that I made out of a chain link fence. So I'm kind of giving this as a for instance. It was just a section of a chain link fence. But when I turned it into a chair-like form, I was still paying attention to, well, I'm using like reclaimed tubing with rivets and cast connectors. And so I took a cue from its language. I think that's what I would say. When I use reclaimed material, I'm sort of learning, and again, this goes into that intrinsic idea from Schopenhauer of how do you make an object still feel like itself, not like I made it do something, but like even if it seems unlikely, it feels right. And so with that chain link fence, when I, gave curves to the piping and changed the whole composition of it, I still put it together with rivets and cast connectors. So it still had that sense of logic that was very much from itself. And I think, with the reclaimed panels and wood as well, it's, when you're carving, you get to see the new fleshy wood. And so the CNC is revealing that sort of fleshy wood versus, what does that exterior weathered section mean and how is that working compositionally and making it still feel like it's its own object.
I see. Interesting. Also, in general, like when you start a new project or new work, what is your inspiration? How you start? How you begin?
Oh, the $1 million question, right? Well, I will say I am constantly looking or thinking about the human form. I know I don't make representational figurative work, but I am constantly thinking about the human figure, where we hold tension in our body, what kind of gesture, when someone's sort of like hunching over, how does that make us feel versus standing up straight, like a cinched waist versus, open and bulging kind of form. So I'm constantly thinking about that and natural elements. I think a lot about flower buds and sort of that kind of structure. So I like to think that in order to get somewhere, just start making. If you start making something, you'll end up making something better. So I will say sometimes I'll make something without knowing what it's going to be, but often I will have a sense of gesture, very informed by the figure and nature that I want to communicate. So particularly sculpturally, I at least have some sense of what kind of gesture. Is this going to be bowing its head over? Is it going to be standing up straight, and what kind of feeling I'm trying to, like what kind of stance I'm going to give the piece.
I see. And then also the public art is also another big part of your practice, but how you move to public art like work from your personal like practice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say it's a big part of my practice at this point. I'm working on, my first public art project, and it's very different. I think it's a good pair, and I like, in that I've worked in design and fabrication, etc. It's a different process that is, in my mind, a bit more design, propose, and fabricate, even though I try to sort of infiltrate my process as much as possible. And so I would never replace my practice with public art, but I would definitely pair it with it. And I think it, it comes with new challenges, and we all learn from working in different ways. So I think, working similar to how I was working with architectural teams at Kieran Timberlake, public art gives me the sort of opportunity to work with the teams that are involved on the project and the space, and sort of how it's going to impact the overall project as well as what I'm doing. And, just sort of documenting a project in a different way. It's good for a change of pace. So
I see.
that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. And then we have one last question. It's like, would you comment a bit more on working with the architect who can only fabricate the smallest building themselves?
Say that again?
Can you comment more about on working with the architect who can only fabricate the smallest buildings themselves?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Comment on working with an architect that can only
fabricate the smallest buildings themselves.
Whether that's a good or a bad thing, or?
I don't know. What do you think? Like rules of drawing, fabrication, model, digital mock-up, and etc.
Oh, rules of drawing, fabrication, digital, and mock-ups. So, I mean, I guess I would say, because I've never worked with an architect who was working at a scale that they could build it themselves. That's why I think I was a little confused. I think that overall, architects they do have a different role in terms of making than like a sculptor does. And they do have a duty and responsibility to document what they're designing in a really clear way. And I know they work a lot more digitally and on paper these days. But I would say that to whatever capacity they're able to, being involved, whether it's being involved with during construction phases, or if it's building mock-ups and prototypes themselves, whatever capacity they have to, I don't want to use the word educate themselves, but like integrate themselves more in the materials that they're documenting, I think always goes a long way in just changing what you might draw or what you might think about a certain material. And also working closely with their fabricators and contractors to just really get a sense of, being in their shop and seeing what material does. And I think it has a really positive impact on the ultimate architectural design.
I see. Okay, thank you so much, Erica, for sharing all your insight and your creative practice with us tonight. And now I'm gonna turn the mic back to Jill.
Welcome back, everyone, to Real Time. Thank you, Erica. There's a beautiful presentation, and we thank you all for attending today's event. A special thanks to both Erica and Doah for their insights. We will share the recording of this talk on the Weitzman School site in case you'd like to rewatch or share with other people. And our next virtual Weitzman School talk, which is Dialogue with Designers, a conversation between Stuart Weitzman and Wendy Evans Joseph, will be held tomorrow, Tuesday, December 8th from 12 to 1 p.m. These inspiring and forward-thinking individuals will discuss their careers and how designers successfully work with clients. You can still register at www.design.upenn.edu. And PWAA, our alumni organization, will be organizing future events in 2021. So keep an eye open for upcoming emails to sign up. We would all like to bring you more interesting talks with people who are part of our alumni group and also our extended members like Erica. So if you have thoughts and you work in a collaborative way, send us some information. You might have ideas about what you'd like to hear about. So thank you all for attending today's talk, and we'll see you very soon. Bye.